Okay, so what we go over today should hopefully be familiar, at least most of it. There might be some details that are a bit new to you, okay? But what we're going to go over is the history of the atomic theory, okay? And then basically the structure of the atom. All right, that part should definitely be a review, okay, for you from previous years here. All right, so the key points, and guys, every time we do a lesson where I'm doing a lot of teaching, the first screen will look like this one. It'll have the lesson number and the key points. Okay? Those key points are the things you definitely want to go over later. They're the things that will be on quizzes and tests. Okay? So, key points, understand how theories of the structure of the atom were developed, okay? And learn the parts of the atom and their characteristics. Okay? Those things should, like I say, those should be a review for you, okay, at this point. Okay, so chemistry has only been a legitimate science for a little over 200 years. Okay? That doesn't mean that we didn't use chemical and physical properties of matter long before that. Okay? The path of things for mankind has been, I don't necessarily care how it works, just that it does work. I don't necessarily have to understand a thing to be able to use a thing. Case in point, your phone in front of you. Okay? You probably don't understand how every single thing in that phone works, but you know how to use it. You know what it can do. It just doesn't really matter how it does it. Okay? So we've been doing stuff like that for a long time. We've used the science of chemistry to dye cloth, to cure meats, okay? To do all kinds of things. Okay? Paint houses, okay? All that kind of stuff. Okay, so we've been using that for a long time, but there were groups of people and certain individuals who kind of progressed our understanding a little more than others, and that's who we're going to look at today. Okay, now, the idea of the atom has been around for a very, very long time. We only confirmed that matter was made of atoms, let's say 350 years ago, okay, but the idea that matter was made of atoms has been around since the Greek Empire. Okay? Now, originally, and continually actually, the Greek Empire believed that all matter was made of four things. What four things? What were the four elements for the Greeks?
Earth, air, water, fire.
Earth, air, water, and fire. Okay? Like that new Pixar movie. Okay? Elemental. Okay? Those are the four elements that they believed everything was made up of. Okay? And it made a lot of sense to them, which is why the idea was kept around for so long, even when the truth of the matter came out. Okay? And people were like, nah, that doesn't make any sense, I don't buy it. Okay? The four element thing works for me. Okay? Well, here's why it worked for them. Okay? They had their own periodic table of sorts, okay, in regards to the four elements. Okay? So for example, steam was some parts water, some parts air, and some parts fire. Because those were the three things that you had to put together to get it. Okay? Steam flows around like air, okay? But you don't get it unless you put fire underwater. Okay? Lava, okay, something the Greeks unfortunately were quite familiar with, okay, would have been some parts earth, some parts fire, and believe it or not, some parts water. Because if you got molten lava coming out of a volcano, does it flow like water? Okay? These were logical things for them. Okay? It made sense. That sort of kind of clear on that? Making sense here? They kept that idea because it made more sense than what Democritus came up with. Okay? Democritus was the first atomist. Okay? He was a Greek thinker, like Plato and Aristotle. Okay? In Greece, being a thinker was like the best job you could have. Okay? You got to sit in the Parthenon all day. Okay? Somebody would like fan you with big palm fronds and feed you grapes and other yummy things, and all you had to do was think and come up with good ideas. Okay? So one day Democritus decided, you know what? It makes sense to me that all matter is made of these tiny, indivisible, not invisible, indivisible, that means you can't break them or cut them, okay, particles called atoms. And everyone kind of looked at him. And then they looked at the guy who was like fanning the palm frond and like, have you not been keeping him cool? Because it seems like he's been out in the sun too long. That idea is crazy. Okay, why would anyone think that? We already know what matter is made of. It's 4 elements. You're silly. Okay, and so the idea was scrapped. Nobody bought it. Okay, even though thousands of years later it was proven to be correct. Okay, so he was the one who came up with the idea of the atom originally. Okay, now it wasn't all bad for Democritus. Okay? He had a few good ideas too. One that sounds like his name. Democracy. Yes, the guy who came up with that idea. So it wasn't all bad. He's just more of a political thinker maybe than a scientific thinker. Okay, that worked out better for him. Okay, then everyone forgot about that. Okay, for thousands of years. Okay, but there was this group of people, kind of during the Dark Ages, okay, who were doing a lot of experiments. They weren't doing science. Science and experiments are two different things. Okay, to be true science, you have to have a problem and a hypothesis and a procedure and an analysis and a conclusion and sources of error, and you're going to communicate that with other people, and you're going to share your ideas and your data with others. That's not what these guys did. Okay? The alchemists, which is what they were called, okay, what they did is they did a lot of trial and error science. They just mixed stuff together. Okay? And their goal was to be able to transmute simple, cheap substances into gold and silver. Okay? They wanted to be able to turn something that was easy to get into something that was very, very valuable. Right? Not realizing at the time that that was completely impossible. Okay? I can't turn lead into gold. Okay? There's no way for me to do that because lead is an element and gold is an element. I can't turn one element into another. Okay? But the alchemists thought they could because they saw lots of times when they mixed two things together, they got something completely different at the end. Okay? They didn't understand that what they were doing was chemical reactions, and it involved compounds and changing atoms around, but not changing one element into another. Okay? That's what they didn't understand because they didn't know about atoms. Okay? They just mixed stuff together, okay, in hopes that they could make gold, or that they could come up with some concoction that would make you live forever, okay? Which, by the way, they made up a lot of those that did the exact opposite. Okay? A lot of people died drinking their elixir of life, and which usually contained like poisonous stuff. Okay? So that was what they did. But in doing that, they actually discovered a lot of things about the behavior of matter. The problem is it didn't progress the science because they didn't tell anybody. They were very secretive about what they were doing because they didn't want anyone to catch on to maybe a good idea that they had, you know, or maybe they thought they were getting close to being able to turn lead into gold, so they didn't tell anybody about it. So it wasn't true science because that part of it wasn't there. Okay? So their labs would have looked something like this. There'd have been, you know, different kinds of containers and flasks and, you know, all kinds of distillation apparatuses and stuff like that. So you can imagine like bubbling cauldrons and stuff. That's kind of what they would have been doing. Okay, it wasn't until Antoine Lavoisier and Roger Bacon, whose names you'll probably never need to know, they came along that chemistry was truly born. Okay? Lavoisier and Bacon came up with the scientific method. Okay? They're the ones that said, if you want to do true controlled science that actually tells you something, you have to run a controlled experiment. You have to have variables that you're keeping track of, okay? Things that you're measuring. You're only testing one thing at a time. You're allowing other people to verify and repeat your experiment, see if they get the same results. Okay? That was their job. So they came up with what would essentially be your lab report, okay, today. A problem, a hypothesis, okay? Materials, procedure, analysis, conclusion. Okay? That was their doing. Okay? How to do a proper, controlled scientific experiment. Okay? From there, that took alchemy to chemistry. Okay, so once that happened, we started getting an idea of how matter is structured, how matter behaves, okay? Things like that. So if I take, let's say, a chunk of, just let's say lead, okay? It's like a chunk of lead, and I start cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces. Okay? Do I need to worry about splitting any atoms? Okay, why not? Like when I'm cutting carrots to make soup at home, do I have to worry about causing a nuclear explosion? Are atoms very, very small? Yeah, very, very small. I'm not going to cut one with a knife. Okay? The sharp edge of your knife is still millions of atoms across. Okay? They're incredibly small. Okay, so it would be like trying to cut a carrot with a hammer. Okay, it would be like trying to cut an atom with a knife. Okay, it's not going to cut. It's just going to do nothing. Okay, you can't. They're too small. Okay. The idea here, though, is no matter how small I cut that lead, is it still lead? I might have more pieces, but all the pieces are still lead. Yes, they all still have the same melting point, boiling point, density, all that stuff. Right? I don't change their physical properties. Okay? I don't change their chemical properties either. Okay? The idea here is that if you could keep cutting them smaller and smaller and smaller, you'd eventually get to a point where you couldn't cut them anymore. Okay? At that point, you'd be down to a single atom. If you cut that atom, then you fundamentally change what you have. Okay? If you were to cut a lead atom in half, okay, you'd go from having an atom with 82 protons to having an atom with 41 protons. So if you could like perfectly split a lead atom right down the middle, okay, you'd end up with 2 atoms of niobium, I guess. Okay? Is that different than lead? Yeah, it is. Okay? So this idea is that the atom is the smallest piece of matter that can retain the properties of that particular material. If I change that, then I change the material fundamentally. Does that make sense to everybody? So the atom's the smallest particle that still retains the properties of that element. Okay. Okay, so probably the most important person when it comes to the idea of the atom, okay, even more important than Democritus, is Dalton. Okay? Dalton was a chemist. Okay? He did lots of experiments involving chemical reactions, and he was trying to explain what happened in those reactions. He knew that he would start with these materials, but at the end he would have different materials, but they still contained the materials he started with. Okay? So let me give you kind of an example here. He could have done an experiment like this, okay, where he would have had, let's say, so let's say he was going to do a chemical reaction between these 2 compounds, calcium chloride and lithium nitride. Okay? When these 2 things react, they produce these 2 things, calcium nitride and lithium chloride. Okay? Now, what he would see in that chemical reaction was his 2 compounds that he started with that had certain colors and textures and all of that kind of stuff. And after the reaction, he had 2 different things that had different properties, different colors, different smells, different textures, whatever. Okay? But what he knew was they were still made of the same things he started with. Okay? In this reaction, I only have 4 elements: calcium, chlorine, lithium, and nitrogen. Okay? And on the product side, I still have the same 4 elements. Did I make any new elements? I didn't. Okay? That goes along with Democritus' idea. Okay? And it says that there must be these small units of matter that can't be changed. They can move around, okay? They can do things like that, but they can't fundamentally be changed. Okay? Those are elements. Okay? Those elements must be made of atoms, these small particles that Democritus originally thought of. Okay? So that led to Dalton coming up with the atomic theory. Okay? The atomic theory has 4 points. Should you know these 4 points? Definitely. That could be a quiz material thing for Tuesday. Okay? Could also be a multiple choice question on a quiz, which of the following is not part of the atomic theory. Okay? So the first part of the atomic theory he stole from Democritus. All elements, and in fact all matter, okay, is comprised of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. Okay, remember it's indivisible, not invisible. Okay, yes, atoms are too small to see, but if they were invisible, all things would be invisible because all things are made of atoms. Okay, indivisible means I can't split them. Okay, at least not by a physical or chemical means. We know now that the atom can be split, but that's a nuclear thing. Okay, that's different. The second point, atoms of the same element are identical. Okay, so if I put 10 oxygen atoms side by side, all 10 oxygen atoms are going to look identical. Okay? Is that 100% true? We actually know now that it's actually not 100% true. Okay? There are things called isotopes, which are slightly different versions of each atom. We're not going to talk about those in Science 10, but it's one of the first things you talk about in Chem 20. Okay? So the atoms of any one element are different from those of any other element. So if I put an oxygen atom next to a lead atom, I'd definitely be able to tell them apart. Okay? Number 3, atoms of different elements can combine with one another in simple whole number ratios to form compounds. This part's important. You have to have whole atoms. A reaction cannot cause an atom to be split. You can never have a fraction of an atom in a compound. Okay? For example, what's this thing? Water. Okay? But I'd never write it like this. Right? I'd never say there's one hydrogen and half an oxygen atom. Half an oxygen atom isn't oxygen anymore, it's something else. Okay? You can never have a fraction of an atom. Okay? In this compound, there are 2 hydrogen atoms, there's 1 oxygen atom, that's it. You never have fractions in a compound. Okay? Because that implies you've split the atom. Okay? Which has somewhat dire consequences. Okay? If you've seen Oppenheimer. Okay? It's the kaboom thing. And the last thing, 4th point was the nail in the coffin for alchemy. Okay? The people trying to turn lead into gold. Okay, that kind of stuff. This was the final nail in the coffin. In a chemical reaction, okay, atoms can be separated. So if I had oxygen, or if I had water here, I could separate it into hydrogen and oxygen. That's what he means by that. Okay, it doesn't mean you can pull atoms apart. It means you can pull the atoms in a compound away from each other. Okay, so when atoms are separated, joined, so I can put 2 atoms together, okay, or rearranged. This reaction here shows rearrangement. Okay, calcium ended up with somebody new on the other side. I rearranged the atoms. Okay? However, atoms of one element are not changed into atoms of another element by a chemical reaction. Okay, so basically he's saying, hey, alchemists, you cannot do this. You cannot turn lead into gold. Okay? A chemical reaction does not change the atoms or the elements themselves. Okay? They can be separated from each other, they can be joined to each other, they can be rearranged like this reaction, but I can't change what's in the reaction. Okay? I can't suddenly say, oh, well, I started with calcium, chlorine, lithium, and nitrogen, but I finished off with sodium instead. It just doesn't happen. Okay? I can't just change one of these elements into something else in a reaction. Okay? Everybody all right with that? All right, so those are the 4 points of the atomic theory. Okay? Important things to know. Okay? And what they mean. All right. So Dalton comes up with this atomic theory. It's a fairly unifying theory. All chemists like it. Okay? Chemists in general accept it. Yeah, this explains all the stuff I've been doing. Good job. Okay? The only problem is the natural follow-up question to a theory that seems to be unifying and everyone can agree with is, okay, what do atoms look like? And to that end, Dalton's like, did you not read the first point? They're tiny. I can't see them. I don't know what they look like. People don't like that. Okay, so Dalton feels kind of pressured to come up with something. So he goes to the most common, kind of natural shape, a sphere. Okay, the sun's a sphere, the The Earth's a sphere, by the way, the Earth's a sphere. Okay, it's not flat. It's round. Okay. Just so we're clear. Okay, Earth's round. Okay, it's a sphere. Lots of things are spheres. So he says atoms are spheres. And everyone's like, okay, we don't have any evidence to prove you're wrong or prove you're right. So okay, atoms are spheres. Okay. So his model of the atom became what everyone accepted for a while. Okay, then atoms are a solid sphere. There's a lot of problems with this model. Okay, namely, what does it not have? What do atoms need to have, at least now that we know now? Atoms are made up of three things. What are they? Two of them are in the nucleus and one of them isn't. What are they? Protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay? Does this model account for those? It absolutely does not. Okay? But at the time Dalton came up with this, nobody knew about those particles either. Okay? The problem is people were doing experiments and their results didn't fit with this model. Okay? In particular, a guy named J.J. Thomson was doing experiments involving what we now call electrochemistry. So he was performing reactions that would result in a charge being produced or an electric current being produced from that reaction. These were the reactions that led to the development of the battery. Okay? So he's got these reactions going on, and electric current is being produced in these reactions. The solid sphere model doesn't explain where this electric current is coming from. If it's from the reaction, what part of this atom is making the current? Okay? This model doesn't explain that. It doesn't have a part of it that's electrically charged. Okay? So J.J. Thomson comes up with a new model. Okay? Because everyone looks at his results and says, you're right. The solid sphere doesn't explain what you're doing. And you're not doing anything wrong. So the sphere model must be wrong. Okay? So what Thomson did is he said, current is produced when small particles that are part of the atom come off. And they'll move from an area of high charge to an area of low charge. Okay? Basically from the positive or from the negative end of the battery to the positive end of the battery. Okay? So he came up with a model that basically just modified Dalton's model. Okay? He kept the sphere. He said, all right, I'm going to keep the sphere. The sphere is good. Okay? I'm just going to say that the sphere is positive, and embedded on its surface loosely are these negatively charged particles called electrons. And in a reaction, the atom gets kind of shaken, and these electrons fall off. Okay? When the electrons fall off, they're what produces the current. They go to other atoms, and they stick to the other atoms, okay? And that explains what I'm doing. And people are like, okay, that sounds reasonable. It accounts for positives and negatives. Okay? It accounts for the current that you're producing in your experiments. It still pays homage to Dalton by keeping his solid sphere. Everybody's happy. Okay? For like 10 minutes. Okay? More experiments get done and people realize if you've got X many negative charges, you need to have X many positive charges. You can't just have a big lump of positive and some negatives stuck on it. Okay? This doesn't really explain some of the other stuff that's going on. So there comes this point in time in chemistry where everybody comes up with their own model. Okay? And they're all okay. They all kind of explain what's going on, but none of them are perfect. Okay? Even now, our model may not be perfect. Okay? But people came up with lots of different things because they kept discovering new parts of the atom. Okay? They started looking at what's the mass of this stuff? Okay? What's the mass of an electron? What's the mass of the matter that's left? Okay? How does this get explained in a reaction? A lot of this came about when we started doing nuclear science. Okay? And knowing that, no, there had to be other parts involved. Okay? And those parts had positive charges, or they were neutral, and they helped make up the proper mass of the atom. Lots of beyond complex science, okay, that went on. So Thomson, he made this model. He called it the plum pudding model. I don't know why. I guess you have pudding and you put plums in it, I guess that's what it would look like, that's what he called it, okay? The plum pudding model. Okay, and then like I said, there were lots of things that went on. We discovered the proton, we discovered the neutron, okay, all of that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of argument about what does the atom look like? Maybe it's still a solid mass that's got everything embedded on the surface, the positives and the negatives and the neutrals, okay? Or maybe it looks something like this, and there's like a central region and negative charges are around the outside, which explain how they come off so easily, okay? Things like that. There wasn't a lot of agreement for quite some time. Okay, so we had discovered the proton, then the neutron was more of an explanation for where the mass of everything comes from. Okay, and then we had a guy named Rutherford come along. Okay, second to Dalton, Rutherford is the most important. Okay, so Dalton's the most important person. Okay, Rutherford is the second most important person because Rutherford did an experiment that proved atoms have a nucleus, and it contains protons and neutrons, and the electrons surround the nucleus. Okay? The challenge in proving this model is that atoms are tiny. Okay? We can't see them. Nobody has a microscope that just looks down at atoms and goes, oh, there they are. That's what they look like. Okay? So Rutherford designed an experiment to test whether there was a central dense region to atoms and how big that region was. Okay? So here's what he did. He suspected that a nucleus existed, but he expected it to be incredibly small. Okay? And he expected that electrons would surround that, and the electrons were incredibly small. Okay? So what he did is he took a piece of gold foil. So imagine like tin foil, like we would use for cooking, but much thinner than that, so that it almost felt like a Kleenex, okay? But it was made of gold. All right, so it was expensive Kleenex, okay? So it was only a few atoms thick, okay? So very, very thin, only a few atoms thick, okay? And he put that in front of an X-ray machine, okay? So his experiment looked like this. Okay, he had an X-ray machine, he had this thin gold foil, and he put around it photographic film. Okay, now I know this is kind of a generation gap thing for you guys because you probably never used a camera that had film in it. Okay, but back in the day, cameras had film in them. Okay, and this film, when you exposed it to light, would produce an image. Okay, it would change from being kind of a dark brown to changing to a different color, okay, whatever. So what he did is he put this gold foil and then he surrounded it with photographic film, and anywhere where the X-ray hit the film would be exposed. There would be a bright spot on the film. Okay? What he expected, okay, was for all the X-rays to basically go through the film, through the foil. Okay? And that he expected that they would all strike back here, and he would get a big exposed spot behind the film. Okay? Because he thought the atoms and their nuclei were going to be incredibly small, and there was going to be really, really big spaces in between them. Okay? Big enough that very few of the X-rays would actually hit an atom and thus be deflected. Okay? Is everyone kind of following me there? What he found was something entirely different. Okay? He did find that some of the atoms, or some of the rays, ended up straight behind the film. They didn't get deflected. Okay? But what he found was a lot of them did. He got bright spots that were almost straight back from the film. And the only way that could happen is if some of those X-rays hit the nucleus of an atom and bounced off of it and were deflected. Okay? So something like this, okay, going this way, and this one going down here. So that would explain how he'd get bright spots that were in much different places than he had predicted. Okay? Based on where those bright spots were, he could estimate how big the nucleus of each atom was. Okay? And it was much bigger than he had thought. Okay? But it definitely proved that atoms are not solid spheres, because if they were, none of them would have got through. Okay? It also proved that they weren't, some other weird shape, but that they were made of a lot of empty space. Okay? Everyone kind of following me there? It was hard for people to get their head around because they solids can't be made of empty space, or I'd be able to put my hand through them. Okay? But they are. Okay? There's a lot of space between the atoms. There's just lots of atoms there. Okay? That's what can make something solid. It's more about the amount of them, okay, than it is about how big they are. And he had such a thin gold foil, okay, that it was only a few atoms thick, so most of the rays hit something at least. Okay? If he'd used a piece of aluminum foil, how many of the X-rays would have got through? None. They'd all bounced right off. Okay? A standard aluminum foil that you get from the store, okay, is so thick that if he tried this experiment, they'd all just bounce off of it. Okay? He was using a very, very, very thin gold foil. Okay? All right, so that's Rutherford. Okay? Super important guy. Okay? Discovered that, proved that, not so much discovered, proved that the atom does have a central dense nucleus. Okay? And it's surrounded by electrons. Now, experiment, awesome. Rutherford's model of the atom, terrible. Okay? Rutherford then said, okay, atoms look like this. Okay? He said they have a central dense nucleus, and all the electrons orbit the nucleus. But in his model, all the electrons orbit the nucleus at the same radius. So that all their orbits are identical in radius. They're all the same distance from the nucleus. Well, that creates a real problem when atoms start to get big. Okay, and by big, I mean if we're looking at something like, lead that has 82 electrons. How do you offset 82 orbits that are all exactly the same radius? You don't. And electrons are all negative, so what do they all do to each other? Like charges, starts with R. Repel. Okay, they repel each other. So if you start putting a whole bunch of electrons really close to each other, they're going to repel each other. Okay, which is going to mean that those orbits become very irregular very fast. Okay, his model really didn't account for that. Okay, so he did a good job of proving the existence of the nucleus, but right away people broke down his model. Okay, so they went to Bohr. Okay, Niels Bohr, and he said, well, they're more like the orbits of planets. They're all at different radii. Okay? That better set things up for repulsion and things like that. Okay, so even after Rutherford, there was still quite a bit of debate over what the atom looked like. Okay? We still, to an extent, accept Bohr's planetary model, okay, where all the electrons are at different distances. Okay? It's modified slightly, but if you were to take a picture of an atom, it would probably look like Bohr's model because everything would be frozen in place in time. Okay? If you were to observe an atom, okay, Bohr's model doesn't really fit because the electrons can actually jump up and down from one orbit to another. Okay? It would be like if Mercury suddenly jumped into Earth's orbit. Okay? Electrons can do that, planets can't. Okay? It's kind of the hole in Bohr's model, okay? Is that the electrons, we know, can actually jump from one orbit to another. They can go further away and then fall back down. Okay? It's actually how photosynthesis works. Okay? When plants are in the sun and the sun is hitting their leaves, the electrons in the chlorophyll molecules pop up and away from the nucleus. Okay? They gain energy from the sun and they move further and further away. And then when the sun goes down, there's not enough energy to keep them there and they fall back down. When they fall down, they release the energy they gained, and that's the energy that plants use to break water and carbon dioxide up and make sugar. Okay? That's what powers photosynthesis, is basically the structure of the atom, okay? And the ability of an electron to jump around. Okay? So Bohr's model doesn't really explain that, so that's why we accept now. Okay? The de Broglie model, or what we call the electron cloud model. Okay, so in de Broglie's model, electrons can be in all places all the time. Okay? They move around. And it's the idea of quantum. Okay? We sometimes also call this the quantum model, okay? Because it allows for electrons to essentially be in many places at one time. They could be anywhere. There's a predictive probability that they're here. There's a predictive probability that they are here. Okay? And another one that says they're over here. Okay? That's the idea of quantums, that these electrons can move around and essentially be everywhere. Okay. All right. Everybody with me there? Questions so far? Okay, so this is our current model of the atom. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. On your unit exam, weeks from now, okay, I'm going to ask you to draw me a picture of a particular element's atom. Okay, so let's pick something simple. Let's say I ask you to draw a picture of an atom of lithium. Okay, how many protons does lithium have? 3. The atomic number tells you the number of protons. By default, it also tells you the number of electrons, because the number of protons and the number of electrons has to be the same so that the atom's not charged. Okay? So I know it has 3 protons, I know it has 3 electrons. How many neutrons does it have? This one's trickier. This is the one where you have to do the subtraction operation. Okay? If you want to find the number of neutrons, you take the atomic mass and you subtract the atomic number. Okay? 6.94 minus 3 is 3.94. Can you have 0.94 neutrons? So how many do you really have, more than likely? 4. Okay, so what you would do then is you would go, all right, here's the nucleus of my lithium. Actually, I wouldn't draw it as a circle because then it would be a solid sphere, so let's take that away. Okay, I would draw the nucleus like this. I'd say, all right, I know that there are 3 protons and that there are 4 neutrons. Okay, so I've got the numbers right, and I've got protons and neutrons in the nucleus where they belong. And then there are 3 electrons in the cloud. Okay, 5 marks. 1 mark for the right number of protons, 1 mark for the right number of neutrons, 1 mark for the right number of electrons, 1 mark for having the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, 1 mark for having the cloud. 5 marks. Is that a gimme question? Really it is. Okay? Draw de Broglie's model, put the right number of particles in it, put the particles in the right place. Okay? I kid you not, that's question 3 on your unit exam. Okay? Because I was playing around with your unit exam yesterday. Okay? That's question number 3. All right, questions on that? Everybody good with that? Does that ring a bell for how to calculate the neutrons? Because that's something you're supposed to learn in Science 9. All right. You know what, guys? I think we'll leave it there for now. We'll talk about the quantum stuff tomorrow, and I'll have you do some questions on the atom to finish off the short class tomorrow. Okay?